Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I miss you guys a lot, and I will be back for sure on Monday. Because the semester is almost done, I thought I would do another one of these video lectures on the Supreme Court so that we're not missing too much time together. And of course, I'm not showing my face because I would scare all of you, but you get to listen to my lovely voice. So here we have the Supreme Court. So the last couple of days, you were looking at the difference between federal and state courts. In this unit, we talk specifically about the federal court system, although it's important to know the difference, as hopefully you know now, and also know the difference between civil and criminal. And we'll discuss all of that when I get back if you have any questions. But let's dive deeper into the Supreme Court here. So this slide deck is in your Google Classroom, so you can follow along with that. There are a couple things that you'll have to stop to complete, and you can find that in Classroom too. So the Supreme Court is obviously, as it says it is, the top court of the land. And this is mentioned in the Constitution, that the Constitution created a Supreme Court. But if you remember from Article 3, it also talked about inferior courts. And so Congress has the ability to create lower courts that they feel are important at the federal level. So Congress over the years has created several different types of special courts, and you can see them here. Anything from tax court to territorial courts. If you look over here, they have created appeals courts and international trade courts. Basically, you can think of the fact that as this country grew, the Supreme Court couldn't handle all of the issues anymore. So Congress started to create lower courts that could deal with other matters so that the Supreme Court could really look at key cases that affect the country on a larger scope. So we have the constitutional courts are the Supreme Court, appeals courts, and district courts. Those are stated in the Constitution. And then special courts are going to be, as I mentioned before, all of the other courts that Congress has created over time. They deal with very specific and narrow cases. And again, before these were created, it would all go to the Supreme Court. But as the Supreme Court had more on its docket, as we call it, the list of cases it's going to hear, they had to create these special courts to alleviate some of that burden. This is just another graph kind of describing the slide before, but you can see there the Supreme Court is the highest court in the federal system. There are 9 justices, although currently there are 8, and we'll talk about how the Senate has refused to have a hearing for Obama's nomination to the Supreme Court. And so we'll discuss that when I get back. But there should be 9 justices. There are currently 8. They still function with the 8 justices. In fact, they are currently hearing arguments this week, and they vote on those cases still until a new justice is appointed. The other day you read the article about the writ of certiorari, and so that's how the cases end up to the Supreme Court. And so we'll talk more about that in a minute. Then you have the Court of Appeals, and this is just what it sounds like. When you don't like a ruling from the lower district court, you don't agree with it, you feel like it wasn't the right decision, you can appeal, and then it's sent to the appeals court. So these are just the different levels that lie within the federal court system. So there's a couple key vocab that I want to make sure that you are aware of, and you've read a little bit about it already in Article 3, but the first one is jurisdiction. So jurisdiction refers to what court will hear the case. And the definition is the authority of a court to hear, try, and decide a case. And so that's where you're seeing Article 3. If the case ends up in a federal court, if it ends up in a state court, you saw that with the scenarios that you did regarding what the jurisdiction is. So Section 2 of the Constitution says that federal courts will hear a case basically for these 2 reasons: the subject matter or the parties involved in the case. So subject matter refers to the constitutional issues. So if you feel like your basic constitutional rights, your amendments have been violated, then it could go to federal court. And you saw that in some of the scenarios that you looked at. The parties involved in the case, well, those were the examples of some of those cases where like a state was suing a state, or a individual is suing the state, or the state suing the individual. So that's the parties involved in the case and how that might end up in federal court. Other types of jurisdiction are exclusive jurisdiction. That means that there's some cases that can only be heard in federal courts. And again, when you did these scenarios the other day, you saw some of those cases that are always going to be at the federal level. If a case can be tried in both the federal court or a state court, which you saw again in those scenarios, then it's called concurrent jurisdiction. So it can be heard both in the federal court and the state court. Original and appellate jurisdiction, what that means is original jurisdiction is where the case has first been heard. So that would have original jurisdiction. If you disagree with the ruling of a case, then you would have appellate jurisdiction. So that's a court that hears a case on appeal from a lower court has what we call appellate jurisdiction over that case. The Supreme Court exercises both original and appellate jurisdiction. So what that means, and it's the only court that can do this, is that they can both hear a case originally and be the first ones to look at a case. They can also hear a case on appeals. And so that's why it would have appellate jurisdiction. So again, the Supreme Court has both original and appellate jurisdiction. You looked at how federal courts appoint in the terms. I'm sorry, my mom's dog is running around, so if you hear footsteps, she's playing right now. But anyway, my mommy's here to take care of me, so you might hear her in the background too. Okay, so the appointment in terms. So federal judges and Supreme Court justices are appointed by the president, and that's subject to the approval of the Senate. And so that's why I was mentioning before that the Senate has refused to have the hearing for the nomination from Obama. So constitutionally, Obama has the right to nominate an individual for the Supreme Court. Per the Constitution, the Senate is supposed to set a hearing and hear the nomination confirmation and decide or not if they want that person to be nominated to the Supreme Court. And the Senate has refused to have the hearing, and we can talk about whether we think that's breaking the Constitution or not when I get back. But it's quite, it's happened several times before in history, and we'll see kind of what that impact has been. Federal judges that are in other types of courts, excuse me, are appointed for life. They can resign, retire, or die, and justices also can face impeachment. If it's a special court, which I showed you the chart before, then they're appointed for 4 to 15 years. So here are the current Supreme Court justices, and as I mentioned, there's currently 8. There should be 9, but Scalia passed away in the spring and has not yet been replaced. And so what I want you to do is take a look at these different justices. And you can click on the links here to their bios. There's one Chief Justice, and that's John Roberts. He's the head of the Supreme Court, and then all the other justices here. So there is a chart in your Google Classroom and Google Doc that I want you to complete. And I just want you to type a few facts about each of the justices. Their education background, who they've been nominated by, how they typically vote for cases, and all that good stuff. So you can pause it and go ahead into Classroom and complete that chart. You just bullet point it. Don't worry about putting too much information in. I just want you to get an idea of who these justices are. So go ahead, pause the video, and then come back when you are ready. Okay, so now that you know who those Supreme Court justices are, I think it'll help as we look at different cases and rulings and impact and all that good stuff. So now you have the chance to take a tour to the Supreme Court. And I, of course, would love to take you to Washington, D.C. to see the Supreme Court in person. It is my favorite building there. It's just majestic and amazing if you haven't been there. But you can go ahead and watch this video here, and it'll give you an inside scoop to the Supreme Court building. So go ahead and watch this video, and I'll see you when you finish watching. Now that you've seen the inside scoop, you can also take a tour of the Supreme Court building. This is a cool link here that you can go ahead and press. And you can go into some of the chambers of the justices. One of my favorite is Ruth Bader Ginsburg's chamber. And that's because if you click here, and we'll talk about the significance of this, is there is a picture of Scalia and Ginsburg riding an elephant. And I'll talk more about this when I get back. But these two individuals could not be more different ideologically than any of the justices on the Supreme Court. So what that means is they disagree with each other on every matter that the Supreme Court will look at. But look, they're like best friends and still ride an elephant. And isn't that to say something in this current political state where we can't get along with anyone that disagrees with us? That here you have Scalia and Ginsburg that are still buddies, even though they disagree on everything politically together. So go ahead and you can explore the other chambers, and we'll talk more about that when I get back as well. Okay, so this chart just talks about the ideologies of the different justices. It's a little complicated, so I can go over this when we get back together on Monday, but maybe this makes sense now as you were researching the different justices. Okay, and this is just reminding you of judicial review. So remember, Marbury versus Madison decided that the Supreme Court would determine if a law is constitutional or not. And I'm going to go ahead and pause it here. I'm going to talk about the rest of these slides when I get back on Monday, but I think that gives you enough to kind of look at and think about and work on for Friday. And just save these slides, the rest of them. If you want to look through them, you can. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and talk about these when I get back on Monday. Okay, miss you all. See you later.